Sawadee Krap. I'm Djasli Phisitkul, and today I'm going to talk about my project, a novel approach to microplastic clumping. So, beforehand, in phase 1 of my project, which was before the October conference, I basically learned how to make LB agar and the LB agar medium. And from that, I learned how to basically make this and make it aseptically. I also learned how to transfer bacteria via streak plate and spread plate techniques. And finally, I learned how to use pretty much some bulk samples for testing, and I collected them. However, I learned many things from that. Like, for example, the fact that I closed most bulk samples likely made it such that most of the bacteria inside were anaerobic at the end, since most of the aerobic bacteria might have died as the oxygen contents pretty much were removed and or taken out. And then after that, for the second phase, or pretty much after the October session, I then basically decided to start off by making some AB media. So that meant that I had to use some really hard and obsolete recipes, in fact. And these recipes were really hard to find in the beginning. And finally, I had to use other pieces and piece them together to actually make the final recipe. And then therefore I had to, for example, change the recipe a bit to make it both for a liquid medium and also such that it would also use the carbon source as mainly plastic, only a tiny bit of sugar from the original amount of glucose that was actually supposed to be put inside. And therefore I had pretty much a different and more novel media than what other researchers used. And also agrobacterial media was pretty much hard for me to find. And that meant that also other research papers probably likely did not use it, because even when I searched for it, I couldn't really find any papers that actually used it, especially on the topic of plastics. And then afterwards, I also created my own LB agar, and this time I put my own twist to it in the fact that instead of basically using mostly other supervisors as help, pretty much or guidance, I finally decided to use everything myself. And now I created everything myself, and I learned how to autoclave and use all these possibly dangerous tools by myself. And that was by pretty much getting supervision initially, and then after that getting taught and then certification to use it by myself. Finally, I autoclaved everything and pretty much used the incubator and even used laminar flow hood without any major problems at all, and actually no problems at all that happened from that. So therefore, everything was rather successful, and I finally made all my plates and I kept them. And after that, I also created some Benedict's reagent, and I used my own kind of twist to it by adding more copper sulfate. Of course, I did some checking, and finally it all worked out as the original recipe meant for it to do. And it was really qualitative, but it still was rather correct. And thus, I continued on with that, and I used it to check as I continued progressing on with growing my bacteria in the mediums. And then finally, I started my testing. However, during the testing, there were, of course, a few issues. Like, for example, the fact that I initially wasn't sure about the amount of Benedict's reagent that I had to put in. So therefore, of course, I did some testing, and I got some controls, and I placed them in, and also the other test tubes as well, and I got a milliliter of each. And finally, after testing that, it showed that the Benedict's reagent in fact worked, and I continued, and I'm still actually testing the Benedict's reagent until now to make sure that it continually works as I continue to use it for testing purposes. And still, it's shown positive, and it continues to work. And then, aside from that, I also learned more techniques in sample collecting. Like, for example, the fact that I had to collect bulk samples of both water, sand, and also soil meant that now I learned how to sample them, and I used the knowledge that I learned from previous years, like for example from phase 1, to make sure that everything was open beforehand, thus such that now all of my bacteria would also possibly be both aerobic and some could still be anaerobic, since their oxygen would flow in. And therefore, as a result, I got soil samples. I used soil samples since I read numerous papers beforehand that showed that soil and plants could possibly help with taking out toxic metals in the soil. So I thought that it might be helpful with microplastics as well. And then I also used some water samples, but mostly some sand samples. And this was since I read other papers, and then I also thought that sand samples are possibly more useful since plastics and also mostly organisms that consume those plastics, like polypropylene, especially that I'm focusing on, are probably not just floating around in the water, but I think that they're actually on the plastics, more specifically. And thus, I probably can find many plastics on the sand, and most of them in the small amount of sand that I collect. And therefore, I continue collecting them, and I learned many other research techniques, and I continued pursuing on. And now, since there's COVID, I'm still waiting and letting it incubate, as eventually I hope that I'll be able to continue on and finally find the organism. And that's pretty much it. Thank you, and